15 of our Primavera P6 training. We're going to be looking at chapter 15, and here we're going to be talking about risk management in Primavera P6. So in project management, we define risk as an uncertainty that can give rise to either a positive or a negative outcome. And that's exactly how risk is defined. So Primavera has a particular module that will enable us carry out risk management within our project. But before we move ahead, let's take a look at risk, and then also let me give you a little bit of a background about risk management and also the processes involved in managing project risk. So under project risk management, there are certain processes, and some of the processes you have in risk management would include the identify risk, and then after the identify risk, so this is process number 1, we have the risk analysis stage. So you have a risk analysis. So under this risk analysis, sometimes this is broken down to what we refer to as a qualitative risk analysis, and then also you could also have a quantitative risk analysis. So at the end of the risk analysis stage, then the next thing we now need to do is we plan our risk response. So this is where you now talk about what you're going to do in the event that the risk eventually occurs. And then you now implement the risk response. So you implement the risk response, and then you monitor and control risk. So the monitor risk is basically a tracking where you ensure that you stay within your risk threshold, and that's what happens during the monitor risk. So if we do a little bit of illustration from what we have discussed so far, let's say from these processes that we've been able to identify. So let's say within our project, we're developing an application, we're developing an app, and then we are asked to identify the risk that may impact or affect the development of the application itself. One of the key risks that can affect the development of the mobile app could be one, risk of hackers. Okay, so let's say for example, you could have hackers who will attack our mobile app, and then another risk that we're able to identify is the risk of technical know-how. So let's say there's a risk that we do not have the technical ability to be able to carry out this particular project, to develop the app itself. So that's the risk of technical know-how. And then another risk we may also identify at this point could be the risk of, let's say, compatibility. So here we'll talk about probably the app might not run on some operating systems. So it takes care of the very first process, which is the identify risk process. Now after that, we now do the risk analysis. So during the risk analysis, this is where you now talk about the probability that the risk will happen, and then if it happens, what will be the impact either on your time, that is the duration of the project, also what will be the impact on the cost. So these are the major aspects that we actually take a look at in the course of our analysis. So let's talk about probability. So for our probability, we're going to be using between 0 to 1. And then for the purpose of this exercise, impact, we're going to be using between 1 to 10. And then also 1 to 10 for impact with regards to cost. So what that simply means is that if the impact on the risk is going to be high, our number will be close to 10. But if it's going to be a low impact, our number will be close to 1. If it's also going to be a medium impact, then our number will be somewhere between 4, 5, or 6. Okay, so let's talk about hackers. What's the probability that hackers may attack our mobile app? So let's say the probability is a 50-50 thing, so it's half. So we say, okay, probability is 0.5. And then what will be the impact if there is an attack? Well, it might have a huge impact on, depending on the scale of the attack, it might have a huge impact on the duration. So let's say for example, we're giving this an 8, and then on cost, let's also say that it will also have a huge impact on cost, so we'll give it an 8 as well. Then in terms of technical know-how, obviously we have the technical know-how to develop this app, so it therefore means that our probability here is quite low, so let's say 0.1. But then what will be the impact if we don't have the technical know-how? That means it's going to take us a lot of time, mistakes and all of that. So that means this is actually going to be a very high impact, and then in the course of it, doing the mistakes and rework, that's going to cost us an additional amount. So that's high cost. Then in terms of compatibility, if the app will be compatible, well, depending on whatever programming language or codes that we use that would to a large extent determine the compatibility with operating systems. So let's say we say, okay, we're going to be using some very malleable programming languages to be able to do this, so we don't have an issue with compatibility. So we say that probability that this could be done the case is also low. So let's say a 0.2, so this is 0.2, and then impact on our time is also going to be high. Okay, so let's say impact is really going to be high because we'll be looking at how we're going to deal with the issue of compatibility. Well, cost might just be moderate, as the case may be. So once we've been able to do this impact, just like we have stated here, we now calculate what we call the expected monetary value. That's the EMV. So our EMV is simply the probability multiplied by the impact that we have just stated. That's exactly how we arrive at our EMV. So in this case, it's going to be 0.5 times 8 times 8. So that's going to be 32. So that means EMV for risk number 1 is 32 in all. And then for the technical scale, the EMV is going to be 0.1 times 9 times 9, which would give us 8.1. And then for the compatibility, the EMV is going to be 0.2 times 9 times 5, which will give us 9. So from the analysis we have done so far, it simply means that hacking is our number 1 priority risk, followed by compatibility, and then technical skill is the risk we should least worry about. Now, based on this, if you're following, so we have done the identify risk process, we have also done the risk analysis, so the next step is the risk response. So during the response part, this is where we now come up with what we're going to do to address this risk. So if it's a negative risk, in other words, if the outcome of this risk is going to be a negative occurrence, there are specific response mechanisms, strategies for negative risk that we can adopt. So we can adopt what we refer to as the ATM strategy. So ATM in this case means avoid. So the A here stands for avoid, the T here stands for transfer, and then the M stands for mitigate. So it's either we mitigate or we reduce. Okay, so these are the strategies we can actually adopt for negative risk. And then don't forget, we also have another strategy which we'll refer to as accept. So accept is also another strategy that we can actually adopt for negative risk. So we can actually decide to accept the risk. It therefore means that if we are thinking of a response to these risks that we have identified here, we should think about them in this line. So in essence, is there anything we can do to avoid this risk? And then after that, we ask ourselves, avoid simply means do away with whatever process that contains the risk, or we transfer the risk. So transfer the risk now refers to talking about taking up insurance, handing over the liability or the risk to a third party. Then mitigate simply means to reduce either the impact on costs, schedule, or to reduce the probability, while accept is simply do nothing. That's exactly the accept response strategy. So for hackers, we can say, okay, what are the responses we can put in place in order to avoid hacking? So we can say we implement strong firewall rules, and then also you can talk about antivirus as the case may be. And then for technical skills, we can decide to outsource. So that's what we refer to as a transfer mechanism. And then for compatibility, we can decide to either reduce or avoid it by using a programming language that would be compatible with all operating systems. So we look at our programming language. All of these things are now what we refer to as the response. So once this response is done, then the next thing is for us to implement the response and then also monitor it accordingly. So if we take a look at our Primavera P6, we're going to be looking at how this is actually done in Primavera P6. So to do that, in your P6 module, okay, this is where we left it in the last lesson. So the detail view, I'm going to change my detail view back to the default view. So to do that, simply go to view and then go to show on bottom, and first of all click no bottom layout. Then again, go back to view, then show on bottom again, then click on details. So once you do that, it will bring up the default detail view for you. So for us to carry out the risk model that we have mentioned, all we simply need to do is we go to our directory and then we click on risk. So when we click on risk, it opens up the risk page for us, and then we simply right click and we click on add. So once we click on add, if you notice, it adds a new risk for you. It will ask you for the risk name. So let's say for this particular construction project that we're doing, that we have a particular risk that we are going to be wary about. So let's say we're looking at the risk of flooding. So that's one of the risks that we are putting into consideration. Say for example, this is done during a rainy season. So here you see the risk category in the next column. So you simply double click within that cell. It will bring up the risk category for you. Then select the relevant category. So in this case, this is a weather risk. So I select weather and then I assign. Then it will ask you the risk type. Remember I said we can either have a positive or negative risk. So if you click on the drop down, it drops down. So you can see positive risk is threat, a positive risk is opportunity, and then negative risk is threat. So because this is negative risk, I leave it at threat. So under the risk status, if you also click within there, you would also see the various status. One is the risk active. Active simply means is the risk currently happening. Then impacted and closed. Impacted and closed simply means that the risk has happened and has been closed. Then managed and closed. It simply means that we were able to manage the risk using our risk response and then we have successfully closed it. So these ones are particularly necessary during the monitor and control risk process, where you now come back and designate your risk appropriately. Then also open risk. Open risk simply means that this risk has a potential of happening. Then proposed risk. Proposed risk simply means that this particular risk is simply suggested or forecasted to happen. And then we also have rejected. Rejected and closed simply means that we thought this could happen, but at the end of the day we'll discover that it's not going to happen after all. So we now reject it. So in this case, we're going to leave it at proposed. This risk is proposed. Then Primavera will ask you for the risk owner. Risk owner would be the person who would be responsible for implementing the risk response. So this is more like the person accountable for that particular risk that will be in charge of tracking the risk and then also implementing the response. So if I click here, you notice that it takes me to my resource page where we have already created resources, and then I can actually choose a particular resource. In this case, I can choose Emmanuel King as the risk owner and then I assign. And then also you see identified by. Again, if I click here, it takes me to the resource part, and then you choose the resource person who identified the risk, and then modified on. This is the date that this risk was reviewed, because your risk analysis is expected is going to be a continuous thing, so there has to be constant review and then updating the risk. Then also exposure start date, when this exposure is probably going to start, and maybe when this would finish. Then of course, if you have further description of the risk, you can impute that under the description. So this is where you put a detailed analysis. Let's say flooding due to heavy rainfall in September. Okay, good. So we have put a description of the risk here. So we have identified the risk, and then remember we said after we identify the risk, the next thing we now need to do is the risk analysis. So if you take a look at the detailed view, you're going to see the analysis part. Now notice that we are in the impact tab in the detailed view, and you will see the probability, then you will see schedule, you will see costs based on what we explained earlier on. So if I go to probability and I click on the drop down, so you can see the various scale for probability. So in this case, because this is Nigeria, and usually we have a large amount of rain during September, it therefore means that probability of flooding is actually very high. So I select very high in this case. How would it affect schedule? Of course, if flooding happens, it's going to have a high impact on my schedule, and it's probably going to have a medium impact on my cost. So you can see Primavera does the expected monetary value for us, and that's exactly what you're seeing here as the risk score in this case. So after you've done the analysis, which is what we have just done, then the next thing is we now go to the risk response. So you can see how we are following those processes one after the other. So you go to the risk response. So it will ask you for your response type. Don't forget, because this is a negative risk, if I click on this drop down, you will see all of those response type we have for negative risk, which includes the accept, the avoid, the mitigate or reduce, and then the transfer. So in this case, we want to see how we can avoid the risk, and then it now asks us for the response description. So what we'll simply say here is no work during the September raining season. So what we're simply saying here is that we're not going to work in September, and that's how we plan to avoid this risk. So after you've done that, Primavera will now ask you what will be the post-response. In other words, once you've implemented this response, what will now be the score of that risk? To what extent would it reduce the risk? So we now go to post-response, then we select whether our response is going to have a high impact on mitigating or avoiding the risk. So we're saying yes, that the impact that after we've implemented the response, the probability that this could happen again becomes actually very low. Would it impact our schedule? Yes, we're going to lose 1 month because we're not going to work during September, so it's going to have a medium impact. And then also for cost might be quite negligible or very low in this case. So you can see, if we implement this response, it will reduce our risk score from a total of 36 to 2 in this case that we have seen. So let's try a positive risk. So again, I click on I right click and then I click on add. Now in this new risk, I'm going to type in exchange rate fluctuation. So in this case, we're looking at a situation where the exchange rate where things could happen in such a way that the exchange rates could get better. So say for example, our currency, the Naira, does better than the US dollar. So it simply means that we're going to be getting more value since we're going to be importing most of the items that we're going to be using. So under the category, I select the category, and then under the category, I'm going to put it on estimating. Then under the risk type, I select an opportunity. And then under the risk status, I leave it at propose. Risk owner, I also select, let's say I select John Doe, and then identified by, I also select the person who identified this, let's say John Doe. And then under the description, I put a description on this. So probability that this will happen is actually very low. Then how would it impact our schedule? Well, if the exchange rate changes, it might really not have huge impact on my schedule, so that's also low. However, what impact would it have on my cost? Well, it's going to have a very high impact on my cost if it's a positive one. It therefore means that the total for my positive risk is 8. So the response for positive risk is we can either share, enhance, or exploit the positive risk. So if you can see, once I click on it, you can see I can enhance, exploit, I can facilitate, or reject it. So I want to select exploit, and then here I put a response description. So if it happens, how are we going to be able to exploit it? We buy our work products in bulk to take advantage of the favorable exchange rate. And then after we've done that, to what extent would our post response now be? So once we've been able to, if we're able to do this, that means we would be able to probability that this is going to impact our project will now be quite negligible. Impact on our project will be negligible, and then also what will be the impact on our costs? So impact on our costs is also going to be quite negligible. So in essence, we've been able to reduce this by 0 to 0 by totally exploiting and taking advantage of this exchange rate differentiation. So this risk now, in the course of the project, we now need to constantly monitor, review, and then analyze the risk and make sure that in the course of the project that the risk doesn't impact if it's a negative risk, or that we're able to take advantage of the opportunity if it is a positive risk. So that brings us to the end of the risk model, and this is basically how to do your risk analysis within your Primavera P6, and that's exactly what we have done right now. So you can also see, if I come to the detail view, I have my risk here. So those risks that I've been able to create, I can now choose a specific activity that the risk may affect, and then when I click on assign, you can see I can choose whatever risk here that I can assign to that activity if this risk is going to impact on such an activity. So I hope this particular lesson has been very informative for you. Once again, thank you for